Teaching in Multicultural School Setting, Introduction. This module is prepared for the course Teaching in Multicultural School Setting. This course is intended to equip learners with competencies required to teach in settings characterized by ethnic, linguistic, social class, religious, gender and many other markers of diversity. Taking democracy, social justice and equity as cross-cutting themes, it strives to build the capacity to inculcate mutual respect and tolerance among the learners. In so doing, it treats topics such as the concept of multicultural education, problems faced minorities such as stereotypes and prejudices, discrimination, racism, sexism, ethnocentrism in educational practices, teaching, curriculum, and the school environment in multicultural settings. In addition, it also treats diversity issues in Ethiopian secondary schools. Objectives of the course. Upon completion of this course, the student will be able to understand the concept of multicultural education, understand diversity issues in schools and the problems related to diversity, develop competencies in teaching, planning, facilitating, managing, assessing, in multicultural environment, exhibit skills of selecting, using and evaluating curriculum materials, analyze mechanisms of promoting diversity in the institutional environment, develop positive attitudes towards diversity in line with the democratic ideals of social justice and equity, analyze multicultural issues in the Ethiopian secondary school context. Unit 1, The Nature and Goals of Multicultural Education. In this unit, 4 major elements are briefly discussed. These are: the concept of multicultural education, goals of multicultural education, dimensions of multicultural education and approaches in multicultural education. As you may know, multicultural education is a global issue. It is difficult or maybe impossible to find a country where all its students are from the same cultural background and ethnic group. For example, Ethiopia is composed of more than 80 nations and nationalities. Thus, as a teacher, you have to know that your students have differences in many terms such as culture, ethnicity, economy, gender and others. So, this first unit will help you to get adequate knowledge about the nature and goals of multicultural education. Read carefully and understand the unit and do all the activities before you proceed to the second unit. I wish you a nice study time. Unit objectives. After completing this unit, you will be able to explain the concept of multicultural education, list down the goals of multicultural education, analyze the dimensions of multicultural education, explore the different approaches of multicultural education. Concept of multicultural education. Multiculturalism as a concept is a 20th century phenomena. This section will acquaint you with some definitions and concepts of multicultural education. Before you read this section, try to define multiculturalism from your own experience and understanding. I am sure you know the words multi and culture, and try to understand what you get by combining these words. Defining culture. Dear learner, what do you think are the main elements in defining culture? Broadly speaking, culture is the system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, technologies and products that a society holds, follows, uses and produces to live in its environment, and passes on from generation to generation. Dear learner, what are the shared beliefs, values, customs, and behaviors of your society or the society in which you are working? Elements of culture. Culture can be characterized by the following four elements. Cultural traits, how the group communicates symbolically through its products, rituals, laws, social structures, economic systems, etc. Cultural patterns, wider, interrelated patterns of behavior and interaction in which cultural traits may take on different meanings. An example is the pattern of grieving, which may involve such as traits as certain behaviors, dress, foods eaten and not eaten, ways of communicating and others. Transmission of knowledge, how the group teaches its young culturally approved and valued ways of behaving, thinking and perceiving. This is a key factor in the continuation of culture, for it gives cultural shape and form to human activity. The simplest activity is the learning of language. Societal structures and processes, how a group regulates, orders and limits group actions to maintain group cohesion and function. Societies represent culture in action, the everyday application of a group through the group's institutions, systems and norms. These can include family structures, educational processes and institutions, how a society manages the health, activities of discourses of its members, how status is defined, legal and economic systems, who can marry whom, age groups and a host of other factors. Group cohesion relies on the transmission and assimilation of knowledge of social structures and processes, and of the norms and expectations that underlie them. The process by which the individual is acculturated, learns the patterns of his or her culture, is also called socialization. Socialization is largely carried out by the family, upon whom the child models much of its adult's behavior, but it also occurs as an effect of the individual's wider social interactions. Socialization ensures the individual's acceptance in the group and conformity to certain social expectations, which in turn ensures that social systems and norms are maintained. Dear learner, did you understand the above discussions? If not, read it again and give your example for each of the elements. Defining multicultural education. Since its earliest conceptualization in the 1960s, multicultural education has evolved both in theory and practice. It is rare that any two classroom teachers or education scholars will share the same definition for multicultural education. As with any dialogue on education, individuals tend to mold concepts to fit their particular contexts and disciplines. Therefore, we should expect that they will use different points of reference in discussing ethnic diversity and cultural pluralism. Yet, when considerations are made for these differences, a consensus on the substantive components of multicultural education quickly emerges. The definitions of multicultural education vary. Some definitions rely on the cultural characteristics of diverse groups, while others emphasize social problems, particularly those associated with oppression, political power, and the reallocation of economic resources. Some restrict their focus to people of color, while others include all major groups that are different in any way from mainstream cultures. Other definitions limit multicultural education to characteristics of local schools, and still others provide directions for school reform in all settings regardless of their characteristics. The goals of these diverse types of multicultural education range from bringing more information about various groups to textbooks, to combating racism, to restructuring the entire school enterprise and reforming society to make schools more culturally fair, accepting, and balanced. For this reason, the field of multicultural education is referred to interchangeably as multicultural education, education that is multicultural, and antiracist education. The following are the most frequently used definitions of multicultural education: an idea, an educational reform movement, and a process intended to change the structure of educational institutions so that all students have an equal chance to achieve academic success. A philosophy that stresses the importance, legitimacy, and vitality of ethnic and cultural diversity in shaping the lives of individuals, groups, and nations. A reform movement that changes all components of the educational enterprise, including its underlying values, procedural rules, curricula, instructional materials, organizational structure, and governance policies to reflect cultural pluralism. An ongoing process that requires long-term investments of time and effort as well as carefully planned and monitored actions. Institutionalizing a philosophy of cultural pluralism within the educational system that is grounded in principles of equality, mutual respect, acceptance and understanding, and moral commitment to social justice. An education free of inherited biases, with freedom to explore other perspectives and cultures, inspired by the goal of making children sensitive to the plurality of the ways of life, different modes of analyzing experiences and ideas, and ways of looking at history found throughout the world. A humanistic concept based on the strength of diversity, human rights, social justice, and alternative lifestyles for all people. It is necessary for a quality education and includes all efforts to make the full range of cultures available to students. It views a culturally pluralistic society as a positive force and welcomes differences as vehicles for better understanding the global society. An approach to teaching and learning based upon democratic values that foster cultural pluralism. In its most comprehensive form, it is a commitment to achieving educational equality, developing curricula that builds understanding about ethnic groups, and combating oppressive practices. A type of education that is concerned with various groups in American society that are victims of discrimination and assaults because of their unique cultural characteristics, ethnic, racial, linguistic, gender, etc. It includes studying such key concepts as prejudice, identity, conflicts, and alienation, and modifying school practices and policies to reflect an appreciation for ethnic diversity. Acquiring knowledge about various groups and organizations that oppose oppression and exploitation by studying the artifacts and ideas that emanate from their efforts. Policies and practices that show respect for cultural diversity through educational philosophy, staffing composition and hierarchy, instructional materials, curricula, and evaluation procedures. Comprehensive school reform and basic education for all students that challenges all forms of discrimination, permeates instruction and interpersonal relations in the classroom, and advances the democratic principles of social justice. Activity. Before we explore these areas further, you might like to examine the above definitions, identify commonalities and differences, and then write out your own brief response to the question, what is multicultural education? These various definitions contain several points in common. Advocates agree that the content of multicultural education programs should include ethnic identities, cultural pluralism, unequal distribution of resources and opportunities, and other socio-political problems stemming from long histories of oppression. They believe that, at best, multicultural education is a philosophy, a methodology for educational reform, and a set of specific content areas within instructional programs. Multicultural education means learning about, preparing for, and celebrating cultural diversity, or learning to be bicultural. And it requires changes in school programs, policies, and practices. Multiculturalists explicitly value diversity and agree that the specific content, structures, and practices employed in achieving multicultural education will differ depending on the setting. Therefore, it is useful for educators to develop their own definitions of multicultural education, within the general boundaries outlined above, to fit their specific needs, rather than imposing a universal structure to implement multicultural education. Multiculturalists also agree that multicultural education has implications for decision-making that will affect operations at all levels of education, including instruction, administration, governance, counseling, program planning, performance appraisal, and school climate. Thus, everyone involved must play an active role in implementing multicultural education. Promoting diversity means acknowledging diversity, incorporating diversity into all levels, and demonstrating pride in cultural pluralism along with a sincere belief that diversity is desirable. The actions taken in schools to adopt multicultural education should reflect the race, language, ethnicity, habits, and customs of ethnic groups throughout the global community. In order to promote a comprehensive understanding of cultural groups, we must use a variety of methods and a composite of various areas of scholarship, including the humanities, arts, social sciences, history, politics, and sciences. To implement multicultural education fully, fundamental changes will need to be made in the conception, organization, and execution of the educational process. These changes require modifications in an educational system that has been governed with a monocultural orientation based on Eurocentric, middle-class cultural norms. Thus, implied in the definitions given above is another concept that finds general agreement among multiculturalists. Multiculturalism requires simultaneous changes on multiple levels of schooling. These changes must be deliberate, long-range, ongoing, and, most important, comprehensive. Goals of multicultural education. The underlying goal of multicultural education is to effect social change. The pathway toward this goal incorporates three strands of transformation: 1. The transformation of self, 2. The transformation of schools and schooling, and 3. The transformation of society. Each of the transformation is discussed below. 1. The transformation of self. As an educator, I have a dual responsibility to engage to critical and continual process to examine how my socialization and biases inform my teaching and thus affect the educational experiences of my students. I have a responsibility to myself to examine the lenses through which I understand the people happening around me. Only when I have a sense for how my own perceptions are developed in relation to my life experience will I begin to understand the world and effectively negative my relationships with the people around me. I also have a responsibility to my students to work toward eliminating my prejudices, examining who is, and is not, being reached by my teaching, and relearning constant process of self-examination and transformation. 2. The transformation of schools and schooling. Multicultural education calls for a critical examination of all aspects of schooling. Aspects of multicultural school transformation include the following. A. Student-centered pedagogy. The experience of student must be brought to the fore in the classroom, making learning active, interactive, relevant, and engaging. Traditional teaching approaches and pedagogical models must be deconstructed to examine how they contribute and support institutional systems of oppression. Known oppressive practices like tracking, even if informal, must be exposed and critically examined. All aspects of teaching and learning in schools must be refocused on, and rededicated to, the students themselves instead of standardized test scores and school ranking. Emphasis should be placed on critical thinking, learning skills, and deep social awareness as well as facts and figures. Pedagogy must provide all students with the opportunity to reach their potential as learners. Be multicultural curriculum. All curricula must be analyzed for accuracy and completeness. All subjects must be presented from diverse perspective. This is related to accuracy and completeness. Inclusive curriculum also means including the voices of the student in the classroom. Concepts such as the canon and classic literature must be interrogated, again with idea of accuracy and completeness, to debunk perceptions such as that the only great literature came from the US and Great Britain. See inclusive educational media and materials. Educational material should be inclusive of diverse voice and perspectives. Students must be encouraged to think critically about materials and media. Whose voices are they hearing? Whose voices are they not hearing? Why did that company produce that film? What is the bias this author may bring to her or his writing? Supportive school and classroom climate. Teachers must be better prepared to foster a positive classroom climate for all students. Overall school cultures must be examined closely to determine how they might be cycling and supporting oppressive societal conditions. Administrative hierarchies in schools must be examined to assess whether they produce positive teaching environments for all teachers. Continual evaluation and assessment. Educators and education researchers must continue to examine the emphasis on standardized test scores and develop more just alternatives for measuring student achievement, ability, or potential. Continuing evaluation must be in place to measure the success of new and existing programs meant to provide more opportunities to groups traditionally and presently underrepresented in colleges and universities. 3. The transformation of society. Ultimately, the goal of multicultural education is to contribute to the transformation of society and to the application and maintenance of social justice and equity. This stands to reason, as the transformation of schools necessarily transforms a society that puts so much stock in educational attainment, degrees, and test scores. In fact, it is particularly this competitive, market-centric hegemony underlying the dominant mentality of the United States, and increasingly, with the help of the world, that multicultural education aims to challenge, shake, expose and critique. This is precisely the reason that it is not enough to continue working within an ailing, oppressive, and outdated system to make changes, when the problems in education are themselves symptoms of a system that continues to be controlled by the economic elite. One does not need to study education too closely to recognize that schools consistently provide continuing privilege to the privileged and continuing struggle for the struggling with very little hope of upward mobility. Informal tracking, standardized testing, discrepancies in the quality of schools within and across regions, and other practices remain from the industrial age model of schools. Only the terminology has changed, and the practices are not quite as overt. Educators, educational theorists, researchers, activists, and everyone else must continue to practice and apply multicultural teaching and learning principles both inside and out of the classroom. We must not allow the knowledge that the vast majority of schools are well-intentioned lead us to assume that our schools are immune to the oppression and inequity of society. We must ask the unquestionable. We must explore and deconstruct structures of power and privilege that maintain the status quo. In a sense, multicultural education uses the transformation of self and school as a metaphor and point of departure for the transformation of society. Ultimately, social justice and equity in schools can and should mean social justice and equity in society. Only then will the purpose of multicultural education be fully achieved. Some of the purposes of multicultural education enable a person to develop the following perspectives: a good self-concept and self-understanding, sensitivity to and understanding of others, including cultural groups in the world, the ability to perceive and understand multiple, sometimes conflicting, cultural and national interpretations of and perspectives on events, values and behavior, the ability to make decisions and take effective action based on multicultural analysis and syntheses, open minds when addressing issues, etc. Activity 1. Justify whether the given purpose of multicultural education are achievable or not. 2. Elaborate each purpose of multicultural education in the light of the Ethiopian context. 3. Compare and contrast the strands of transformation as a way to set multicultural education goal setting. Dimensions of multicultural education. Dear learner, in the previous two sections of the unit, you have been learning about the social categories and approaches of multicultural education. In this lesson you will study about us dimensions. Banks, 1993, describes the dimensions of multicultural education in 5 overlapping areas in which researchers and practitioners are involved. These dimensions are used widely by education systems to conceptualize and develop courses, programs, and projects in multicultural education. The 5 dimensions are: 1. Content integration. 2. The knowledge construction process. 3. Prejudice. 4. Equity pedagogy. And 5. Empowering school culture and social structure. Although each dimension is conceptually distinct, in practice they overlap and interrelated. Learning objectives. At the end of this section, you should be able to differentiate each of the 5 dimensions of multicultural education. Explain the applications of the dimensions in school and classroom settings. Evaluate your school environment, curriculum, and classroom practice in terms of the dimensions of multicultural education. Explain the contribution of multicultural education to quality of education. Discuss the interrelationship of the dimensions of multicultural education. Content integration. Any curriculum does have content which is instrumental for the attainment of the educational objectives. Activity. Dear learners, before you study content integration as one dimension of multicultural education, you need to clearly understand the meaning of contents. 1. How do you understand the meaning of curriculum content? 2. What is the role of curriculum content in the teaching-learning process? Write down your ideas. Content refers to the concepts, facts, principles, rules, skills, attitudes, etc. Students learn in order to achieve the intended objectives. In regard to the dimensions of multicultural education, Content integration deals with the extent to which teachers use examples and content from a variety of cultures and groups to illustrate key concepts, principles, generalizations, and cultural content into a subject area is logical and not contrived when this dimension is implemented properly. Activity. What specific ethnic and cultural contents can you think of that should be integrated into the primary objects and curriculum of your schools? Into which subjects can these contents be integrated? Write down your answers. More opportunities exist for the integration of ethnic and cultural content in some subject areas than in others. There are frequent and ample opportunities for teachers to use ethnic and cultural content to illustrate concepts, themes, and principles in the social studies, the language arts, and in music. Opportunities also exist to integrate multicultural content into math and science. However, they are less ample than they in social and the language arts. Content integration is frequently mistaken by school practitioners as comprising the whole of multicultural education, and is thus viewed as irrelevant to instruction in disciplines such as math and science. To implement the process of multicultural curriculum reform, Banks has outlined our successive levels of integration of ethnic content. These levels called approaches are contribution approach, additive approach, transformation approach, and social action approach. The contribution approach focuses on heroes and heroines, holidays, and discrete cultural elements. When using the additive approach, teachers append ethnic content, themes, and perspectives to the curriculum without changing its basic structure. In the transformation approach, which is designed to help students learn how knowledge is constructed, issues, events, and themes from the perspective of various ethnic and transformation approach, students make decisions on important social issues and take action to help solve them. These approaches provide teachers with an easily infusible, curriculum step-ladder entry into the ongoing process of multicultural education. These levels will be discussed further in Unit 3 of this module under Approaches of Multiculturalism. Activity. Identify at least 5 cultural issues from your locality that need to be addressed by the primary school curriculum. Indicate also the subjects and grade level in which it should be included. Knowledge construction process. It is a common phenomenon that students may have certain misconceptions about the world. We all did and still have certain misconceptions. For instance, we can remember the difficulty we did have to accept the reality that is the Earth, and not the Sun, that rotates. Students have many similar misconceptions. Before you go on reading these topics, reflect on the following questions and if possible, discuss with your friends. Activity. Why do students sometimes acquire misconceptions about the world, and how do such beliefs affect later learning? What strategies can we use to encourage students to correct their misconceptions about the world? In the words, how can we promote conceptual change? How do we learn? Watching a young child grows from infancy to toddlerhood, we marvel at the amount of learning that has allowed her or him to understand his expanding environment. Those early years provide the basis for language, physical dexterity, social understanding, and emotional development that he or she will use for the rest of his or her life. What a vast amount of knowledge is acquired before she or he sets foot in school. This child taught herself or himself by gathering information and experiencing the world around her or him. Such learning exemplifies constructivism. Constructivism emphasizes the importance of the knowledge, beliefs, and skills an individual brings to the experience of learning. It recognizes the construction of new understanding as a combination of prior learning, new information, and readiness to learn. Individuals make choices about what new ideas to accept and how to fit them into their established views of the world. Activity: what specific knowledge, beliefs, and skills do you imagine students of your school would bring to the classroom that would help to enrich the teaching-learning process? Please list them down. The knowledge construction process encompasses the procedures by which social, behavioral, and natural scientists create knowledge in their disciplines. A multicultural focus on knowledge construction includes discussion of the ways in which the implicit cultural assumption, frames of reference, perspectives, and biases within a knowledge construction process is an important part of multicultural teaching. Teachers help students to understand how knowledge is created and how it is influenced by factor of race, ethnicity, gender, and social class. Multicultural teaching involves not only infusing ethnic content into the school curriculum, but also changing the structure and organization of the school. It also includes changing the ways in which teachers and students view and interact with knowledge, helping them to become knowledge producers, not merely the consumers of knowledge produced by others. The constructivist teachers set up problems and monitor students' exploration, guide the direction of student inquiry and promote new patterns of thinking. They refer to raw data, primary sources, and interactive materials to provide experiences to their students rather than relying solely on another's set of data. For teachers who have used only one printed text, the shift to other sources may take some adjustment. For example, rather than reading about a census, students examine and interpret census data. Or they may plan a mini-census, gather their own data, and interpret the results. Our students represent a rich array of different backgrounds and ways of thinking. Myths, taboos, and things we learn from our families, friends, and teachers all are part of cultural influence. Content is embedded in culture and it is difficult to separate the two. When presented with information in the classroom that contradicts existing ideas, a student may try to accommodate both interpretations, rather than change deeply held beliefs. Unless the teacher realizes what views the student hold, classroom teaching can actually help students construct faulty ideas. Multicultural teaching and learning, paradigms, and concepts that exclude or distort the life experiences, histories and contributions of marginalized groups are challenged. Multicultural pedagogy seeks to reconceptualize and expand the Western canon, to make more representative and inclusive of a nation's diversity, and to shape the frames of references, perspectives, and concepts that make up school knowledge. The Western canon is a term used to denote a canon of books that has been the most significant in shaping Western culture. Although previously held in high regard, it has been the subject of increasing contention through the latter half of the 20th century. Multicultural feminists have developed a number of conceptualizations that are designed to help teachers acquire the information and skills needed to teach students how knowledge is constructed, how to identify the writer's purposes and point of view, and how to formulate their own interpretations of reality. Tetult, 1993, describes a model for teaching content about women that are also designed to help students understand the nature of knowledge and how it is constructed. In this curriculum model, the teacher moves from a male-defined curriculum to a curriculum that is gender-balanced. The phases are as follows: contributions curriculum, bifocal curriculum, women's curriculum, and gender-balanced curriculum. In the contributions curriculum, a male framework is used to insert women into the curriculum. The world is viewed through the eyes of women and men in the bifocal curriculum. Subjects of primary importance to women are investigated in the women's curriculum. And the gender-balanced curriculum investigates topics and concepts that are important to women but also considers how women and men relate to each other. Activity: imagine that you are a new teacher. You discover that your students have several misconceptions about the subject matter your students will be studying over the next few weeks. Describe 3 different strategies you might use to help your students correct these misconceptions. Equity pedagogy. Activity: dear learners, you might have heard of the term prejudice in some way in your experience. How do you understand the concept prejudice? Can you describe it in a sentence or 2? Prejudice is a negative or hostile feeling or attitude toward a group or a person who belongs to a particular group because he is presumed to have the negative qualities ascribed to the group. Prejudice is a frame of mind or an attitude which prejudges a person or group without sufficient experience or evidence. Most often these prejudices can become commonly held beliefs which are usually used to justify acts of discrimination. Stereotypes emerge from the process of making metal plates for printing. When people are stereotyped, it means having a set image of that group of people which is then used to represent that particular group. A stereotype is an oversimplified generalization about a particular group, which is usually negative and unfavorable, without sufficient basis. Activity: how does prejudice develop? Does it have any societal basis? What kind of prejudice is manifested in your locality? Prejudice occurs when negative attitudes concerning a social group are extended toward an individual based upon that individual's perceived membership in the group. Discrimination occurs when there is an action, based on the prejudice, which denies a person or group equality of treatment, and is rarely if ever based on facts or truths. Discrimination usually leads to the denial of certain rights for some groups of people. It may be expressed directly in discriminatory actions and oppressive behavior, or indirectly, where a neutral, or seemingly harmless, policy, rule or practice has a discriminatory effect against a certain group of people. Discrimination is structural and systemic, when it is embedded within organizational procedures as standard practice. Prejudices and stereotypes have been a common feature in human relationships. Members of any group often attribute certain negative traits to other groups who are different. The differences may be in any of the following: race, skin color, physical appearance, gender, age, socioeconomic class, ethnic origin, religion, language and other cultural or behavioral expressions, among others. These stereotypes and prejudices often exist in one's environment when one is born, and are often reinforced as one grows up. Discrimination is therefore learned by young people through socialization and the environment around them, in the family, community, school and through the media, which can influence the development of negative attitudes and behaviors that depreciate the status and worth of discriminated groups. Translated into conduct and practices, such attitudes become the basis for discrimination, ethnocentrism, and racism, with all the effects of intercultural mistrust, domination, and conflict that accompany them. Activity: what do you think would be the effects of prejudice, on the individual, on the society, and on the education? prejudicial attitudes and beliefs undermine principles of social justice in a democracy. Prejudice in schools is especially troubling because schools are public places in which students learn to negotiate and construct knowledge of differences. When prejudicial beliefs go unexamined in schools, students are not given the opportunity to deconstruct prejudicial knowledge. The impact of prejudicial attitudes on students is wide-ranging, spanning from lower school performance to poor physical and mental health. The reduction of prejudice is vital for equitable and vigorous learning environments that foster students' academic, mental, and physical health. Prejudice reduction. Dear Lena, stop for a moment and think about the two concepts of equity and pedagogy. How do you understand them? What is meant equity? What do you remember from your earlier courses about pedagogy? How could there be equity in pedagogy? Equity refers to fairness. Equity in education refers to accessibility of education as well as provision of accessible curriculum to all students. Educational equity is very fundamental for all students since educational excellence is unattainable for any student when certain groups are denied a fair chance to receive the highest quality education. It is one thing to provide access to schools for students from diverse backgrounds. It is another to build a culture where they feel authentically included. It is yet another to ensure that they succeed. An empowering school culture, activity, equity pedagogy emanates from the assumption that students in every classroom are different. What kind of differences can you think of that may exist among students in the classrooms of your schools? In what ways can the differences among students in a classroom affect their learning? Equity pedagogy exists when teachers modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse racial, cultural, socioeconomic, and language groups. This includes using a variety of teaching styles and approaches that are consistent with the range of learning styles within various cultural and ethnic groups. It also includes using cooperative learning techniques in math and science instruction to enhance the academic achievement of the marginalized groups of students. Equity pedagogy rejects the cultural deprivation paradigm that was developed in the early 1960s. This paradigm posited that the socialization experiences in the home and community of low-income students prevented them from attaining the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed for academic success. Because the cultural practices of low-income students were viewed as inadequate and inferior, cultural deprivation theorists focused on changing student behavior so that it aligned more closely with mainstream school culture. Equity pedagogy assumes that students from diverse cultures and groups come to school with much strength. There are strong correlations between the different cultural characteristics and the learning styles of ethnic groups. Multicultural education endorses both as critical components of equity pedagogy for racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse students. Implementing them in practice requires building bridges among diverse cultures and school programs, policies, and practices, as well as transforming the culture of school to make it more reflective of the diversity that characterizes a society. Activity. What approaches can teachers use to address the differences among students in their classes so as to enhance their learning? To resolve these cultural incompatibilities, they first have to specifically identified, and then strategies devised to overcome them. This is another area of development that is growing in multicultural education. Some significant progress is being made in identifying conflict points among different cultures, accompanied by general suggestions for how to resolve them within the context of classroom instruction. Much more development is needed in making these ideas more precise and practical for the various dimensions of teaching. Approaches to multicultural education. There are different teaching approaches in the system of multicultural education. Each teaching approach has a unique characteristic on its implementation. They are discussed below briefly. Try to understand these teaching approaches in terms of diversified instructional process. Sleater, 1996, has outlined 5 teaching approaches in multicultural education. Teaching the culturally different approach. Advocates of the teaching the culturally different approach attempt to raise the academic achievement of students of color through culturally relevant instruction. Human relations approach. In the human relations approach, students are taught about commonalities of all people through understanding their social and cultural differences but not their differences in institutional and economic power. The single group studies approach. The single group studies approach is about the histories and contemporary issues of oppression of people of color, women, low socioeconomic groups. The multicultural education approach. The multicultural education approach promotes the transformation of the educational process to reflect the ideals of democracy in a pluralistic society. Students are taught content using instructional methods that value cultural knowledge and differences. Social reconstructions approach. Educators who use the social reconstructions approach to multicultural education go a step further to teach students about oppression and discrimination. Students learn about their roles as social change agents so discrimination. Students learn about their roles as social change agents so that they may participate in the generation of a more equitable society. Be aware that these categories overlap, and educators may use more than one approach simultaneously. Activity. What are the merits of using different teaching approaches in a classroom? Dear learner, there are different approaches to multicultural education from different writers. What we have seen above is from Sleater, 1996. For better understanding, presented below are approaches given by Banks. 1. The contribution approach. This approach reflected the least amount of involvement in multicultural education approaches. This is incorporative by selected books and activities that celebrated holidays and special events from various cultures. For example, spending time reading about Dr. Martin Luther King in January is common practice that falls into this category. In this approach, cultural diverse books and issues are not specified as part of the curriculum. Activity. Dear learners, on the basis of the above example, from our country perspective, what else historical or cultural causes of making students study or reading assignment can you design for your class? Hint. A reading passage in Amharic textbook on cultural process of weeding during the month of January and the teacher gives students a home-take assignment to further discover about the process from their localities. 2. The additive approach. In this approach, content, concepts, themes, and perspective are added to the without changing its basic structure. This involves incorporating literature by and about people from diverse cultures into the mainstream curriculum without changing the curriculum. However, this approach does not necessarily transform thinking. Activity. Dear learners, I am sure you are aware of the effect of globalization in becoming as additive culture to our indigenous lifestyles. Hence, can you mention some examples that can be considered the additive approach to the teaching and learning process of our curriculum? 3. The transformation approach. This approach actually changes the structure of the curriculum and encourages students to view concepts, issues, themes, and problems from several ethnic perspectives and points of view. For example, a unit on Thanksgiving would become an entire unit exploring cultural conflict. This type of instruction involves critical thinking and involves a consideration of diversity as a basic premise. 4. The social action approach. This approach combines the transformation approach with activities to strive for social change. Students are not only instructed to understand and question social issues, but to also do something important about it. Self-test: which type of multicultural approach have you been delivering so far in your respective schools? Why? Summary: for teachers of young children to be able to respond appropriately to a child's racial and ethnic identity, it is critical they have a clear understanding of the complex process of racial identity development in children, beginning in infancy. For this reason, in this unit the definitions and concept multicultural education is discussed in detail. Multicultural education is a complex and multi-dimensional concept. James Banks has identified 5 interrelated and overlapping dimensions to describe the field's major components and to highlight important developments within the last 2 decades. 1. Content integration. 2. The knowledge construction process. 3. Prejudice reduction. 4. An equity pedagogy. And 5. An empowering school culture. According to James Banks, the 4 approaches to multicultural education are: the contributions approach, the additive approach, the transformation approach, and the social action approach.